From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Okay.
We're back on. Okay. Today is Thursday, July 14, 2011. My name is Joe Meunier of the Southern Oral History Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm with videographer John Bishop on the campus of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, to do an interview for the Civil Rights History Project, which is a joint undertaking of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And today we're with Dr. Freeman Hrabowski, and I must say it's a real privilege and honor, so thank you so much for sitting down.
Thank you.
Let me have you start, if you would, just with a description of family, community in Birmingham, coming up as a child. You were born in August of 1950.
Sure. I honestly believe I was as fortunate as a child could be, a child of color could be, born in the 1950s. I had parents who were educated, who were older, and who had been married 10 years. And so they were really looking for me. Fine Christian people, very hardworking. And we lived in a neighborhood, a middle-class neighborhood, with similar families. The emphasis was on education, on our faith, on values, and on building strong community among the people in that area. That was my background in Birmingham. Church was at the center of everything.
Which church?
6th Avenue Baptist Church, the sister church to the one that was bombed, actually, in Birmingham.
Tell me a little bit more, if you would, about your mother and your father and kind of your family's history going back.
Sure. My mother and father grew up in rural areas, and as was the case with so many people in the big city, they had come off of farms. Mother was born in 1916. My father was born in 1910. And they had actually met in college. My dad had been away teaching because you could teach after 2 years, had come back, and it was in 1938. My mother had transferred from Alabama A&M, where she'd gotten the first 2 years, because that was as far as they went at that time, and she wanted to continue on to get the bachelor's. And so they met in Montgomery at Alabama State, a few blocks from the Capitol there, and they were married in 1940. And one had come from Wetumpka, Alabama, which is outside of Montgomery, and my father had come from Sardis, Alabama, Lowndes County, outside of Selma, in fact. And my father had lived on land that was a part of a larger plantation, which had been a part of his family. And it was my father, Freeman II, whose grandfather was the son of the plantation owner, right? And my grandfather, Freeman I, was the first one born after slavery. And if you think about it, it literally was from the 1870s to my dad in 1910, and then he was 40 when I was born, and it's right there. So you have that period very quickly. Mm-hmm.
And your father's employment in Birmingham when you were born was, and coming up was?
My father had been a teacher, but you couldn't make a lot of money as a man of color teaching, and so he left it to work in the steel mill because you could make much more money over time. But Dad had special skills. He was really good in reading and mathematics, and so not only did he work in the steel mill, but he did the reading and writing for his white supervisor, who did not have a high school education. Behind the scenes, he did that work and got paid for it. And then he worked for the railroad, and he also did some of the reading and writing for a supervisor there. And then he worked in with the families who were grieving in a funeral home. So my dad worked 3 jobs. My mother worked 3 jobs. She taught in the day, and later on taught also GED in the evenings, math and English. And she sold insurance, and she tutored kids, and sold snowballs in the summertime. So they were very entrepreneurial.
Which mill? The steel mill?
Stockham Valve Fittings. Stockham Valve Fittings. And my mother was at a school very close, Shields Elementary. But we grew up in one of the 2 middle-class neighborhoods of Birmingham. We grew up in Titusville, Titusville, The other neighborhood, of course, was Smithfield.
How many jobs did you have compared to your parents?
And it was a very special place.
Siblings later or no?
I had a cousin whom my parents adopted who grew up with me.
Tell me a little bit more about the rhythm and culture of middle-class black life in Birmingham in the 50s, especially around church and neighbors and extended family.
We seemed to always be in church. And children really didn't want to be there. But we were very involved in all kinds of activities. The youth fellowship, Baptist training units, the choir, going on trips and camps, Bible school. And it was just a part of home, but it was not necessarily what we would have wanted to be doing, but it was what was expected. So you just did it. You did it in the summer, during the year. But I would also say we were in and out of other homes, and others were essentially parents too. And we were learning much about our values and expectations, as much from other parents as from our own.
Yeah. Who was your pastor?
Reverend John T. Porter. Now, he came when I was 12. Before him, it was Reverend Goodgame. But at age 12, he came back from Detroit. But he was a favorite son. He had grown up in that church. He had gone to Alabama State himself and had the Morehouse experience and was an incredible man. He came back, he was 32 and I was 12. And he was an incredible pastor. I think my speaking skills come from listening to him all the time. And he was amazingly accessible. He spent a lot of time with the teenagers, with the kids, talking about everything in ways that even our parents wouldn't talk about them. And it just made us very close to him. He and his wife, in fact, she had graduate degrees in music and voice from NYU. And so our church was very cultured, as we would say in the South. We grew up with piano lessons, and you'd hear Bach in church, and so it was different from what the larger society may have thought always happened. It really shows the diversity within the black community.
Well, indeed, and I wanted to ask, did a couple things. One is, looking back, did your family have a wide array of neighbors, family, persons through the church who had a wide class background, or was
It's a fascinating question.
it more sort of a more narrowly defined middle class?
This is very middle class, very middle class. But understand something: the middle class had people with graduate degrees and the few lawyers and physicians. But the middle class also included people who worked for very wealthy whites. It was very interesting when I think back. So if someone was not educated, that person was still very polished because they had been around the best of whites. And so they might travel to Europe with their employees. And they were the beneficiaries of the exposure that wealthy whites were getting. And so they had their own contribution to the community in very interesting ways. So we had a combination. Most were teachers, and the women were teachers. In some cases, the men were teachers. But sadly, if you wanted to make more money, you didn't, unless you were a principal, and then you made a bit more money. And we had principals in the neighborhood. But so you had that kind of. Now, I will say, my parents were constantly helping people who were not educated. We were constantly working with kids to get them into college. My mother would fill out the financial aid forms all the time and work with them on applications and essays. But even more than that, because Mother worked on the GED, she was working with parents of kids and pushing families to send their kids to college. And not just relatives, but people in general. And my father was very good at advising men. Women would always say, you need to go talk to, and in Birmingham, the name was pronounced Hrabowski. You see, I say Hrabowski because a Polish professor said your name is not Hrabowski with the spelling. But there, often my parents served as advisors or counselors to married couples when they were having problems. So they were everything from marriage counselors to helping people get into college.
Did your dad have a title in the church?
He was a deacon.
Yeah.
He was a deacon. And I'll tell you what was significant about 6th Avenue when they were building this really big church, when we were moving from 6th Avenue and 16th Street south to out to the Titusville area, more so in a modern church, because UAB was going to be taking over all that area. A number of the families were asked to put up their mortgages for the church. And there is a wall in the church with those families' names. But this is how closely connected the church and the families were. And one of the great prides of Birmingham was that the Birmingham, the Birmingham News is the big white paper, had published an article on the front page of the paper, which is very unusual. The Birmingham World was the black paper, so we were accustomed to being there. But the Birmingham News published a piece, front page story at the top there, that at one point in the late 50s and early 60s, before the civil rights movement, as we think about it in the early 60s, that we had more Negroes who owned their homes than any city in the country. Now, owning their homes meant they were buying their homes, they had the mortgages, right? But they were not renting. And it was because of this robust economy involving the steel mills and the teachers. And so that was the greatest pride of any family, to own a home. And a home with 2 or 3 bedrooms, big deal. And as the time went on, the 2 and 3 bedroom homes added on a room, the extra den, middle class America. But the homes were the symbol of the status.
And of course, this is before all of the economy, the industrial economy is evolving. It's still very robust.
Yes.
In that kind of urban context, would you have had white acquaintances coming up?
Oh, absolutely not. I had never met anyone white. I simply knew that white children were considered smarter than black children. We were told that in so many ways, in subtle ways. The first time I realized just how distinct the two groups were, and distinctly hierarchical, was I was peeling back the brown paper sack bag cover of the book I'd been given in the 2nd grade. We had been told to leave it alone. And I peeled it back and I saw the name of the white school. And I went up and asked the teacher, why did they give us the secondhand books? Because that was such a message to us, you see. Of course, my teacher first said, we told you not to peel the paper back, so I was in trouble. But what she said was the same thing my parents always said, and I've said this so many times. She said, you don't have time to be a victim. Get over it. You don't have time to be a victim. The book may be second rate. You are first rate. You are a child of God. Get the knowledge and keep moving. Powerful, powerful message, which I didn't want to hear because I was upset, right? And while it may seem that she was being harsh, she was preparing me for life. Absolutely preparing me for life. Focus on the real things, the things that you can change.
So we should stop for just a sec. We're back.
Mm-hmm.
We're back after
Yes.
a very short break.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Hrabowski, I wanted to ask, you were just mentioning schools, but
Yes.
before we do that, you were also
Mm-hmm.
mentioning sort of this political, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but this message that a teacher gives to you about, we're in this circumstance, but we're going to forge ahead with a certain kind of,
Sure.
assertive
Yes.
mode of practice.
Mm-hmm.
Was your house, were your parents, was your church community sort of actively political, say through the racial questions of the 50s? Was that something that was around your dinner table? Did you hear it from the pulpit? Or
Right. We heard about political issues and race matters all the time. My parents enjoyed being race people. I think my mother was probably most proud, was proudest of the fact that she had been fired in another school system because she tried to organize teachers in the late 40s to protest or to demand equalization of teacher salaries.
where was that?
This is outside of Birmingham, one of the systems right outside of Birmingham. And people were appalled that she would do that. But as she said, she was just foolish enough to try. And she was indeed fired. But she was such a good teacher that within a short period, and this was right before 1950, and I know it because she wasn't teaching long. She got a job in Birmingham City, which was really the plum place, right? And then we called him the Negro superintendent. He was the director of colored schools. But Dr. Carol Hayes hired her. He liked my mother because she was very smart, and very comfortable with herself. And he hired her, and she worked there until she retired in Birmingham.
Yeah. Well, late 40s was the time when those equalization efforts were underway, because obviously states were trying to see if they could somehow fend off desegregation.
Yes.
That's very interesting, though. How about your father?
My father did several things. He was working with the men in the steel mill to get them to get their GEDs. So he tutored them, particularly in math. Dad was always very good in math, and he always loved teaching. So he was constantly working with these guys. And he wrote the Negro section of the bulletin. I actually still have copies, and they were lessons about life. But there was this bulletin from the company every week or 2 weeks, and there was a Negro section. And so Daddy was one of the few literate people, and he wrote this section, advice to the men. And so he was doing that. And while he couldn't say openly in that bulletin, we know people are not fair here, he focused on what the men needed to do to support their families, the need for the hard work, for being your best. And I think the message that they both were saying to me was the same message that so many black children heard, particularly in the Deep South. The world is not fair. We know that. So the question is, what do you do about it? You must be twice as good. You will hear that over and over again, that don't expect fairness, but be twice as good, and perhaps you will be selected. That was just the way of the world. Now, the good part about that is you learn to work really hard and to focus on self-empowerment. You weren't expecting anybody to give you anything, which may sound old-fashioned, but I quite frankly use that same philosophy with students today. Not so much about twice as good, just working to be the very best. But what I say is twice as good in the sense that Americans need to learn to work much harder than people from other parts of the world. So it's the same thing for my white students as anybody else. For my women students, everybody. It's a great philosophy.
Were your parents members of the NAACP?
Oh, yeah, very much so. NAACP, Alabama Christian Movement. Oh, yeah. Very much so. Very proud members.
Your father's college degree was in what field?
It would have been something in education.
Yeah, okay.
Education. Mother always had, it was education too, but she was always with a focus in English. Yeah.
At the mill, we're about to move on into some more of the active events of the 50s, but the last question was, your father's age, would that have put him just beyond that period when there was active and for a while interracial efforts to do union work inside the mills in Birmingham?
That would not, no, he would not have been a part of, no, would not have been a part of that.
Tell me about, and you having been born in the 50s, I mean, it would have taken a while to some of these things sort of come to your attention, but what stands out in your mind as some of the first impressions of open social questions about race, maybe towards the mid to late 50s? Of course, you're a young child.
Well, keep in mind that other than our going to separate schools and seeing those books, when I think back, we were very protected in many ways for a long time. That was the significance of the black middle class community. People worked to give us as many experiences as possible to make us feel as special as possible. It was only when we realized it was kiddie land. You'll hear even my friend Condi talking about this. All of us were aware that kiddie land was this great place with the big Ferris wheel and all the lights and all the children, and we'd all have to pass that when you went to a certain part of Birmingham, and imagine a child seeing all these kids in there having fun, and we couldn't go. That was devastating. And finally there was a small, third-rate little place where you could go and have a party or something, but it was nothing. Really was not. That was bothersome. And as we got older and wanted to go to the movies, to the whatever we call it, movie house, movie theater, whatever, we had, of course, to sit in the balcony, certain places to sit. And then as we wanted to begin to go to restaurants or places, we had to go in a side door. We couldn't go in, or we could go in and get a to-go, but not order and sit. And then when we went to stores to buy things, we could be doing something. If somebody white came up, we were to wait. And so more and more, my parents decided that they would just keep us from doing those things after they realized the impact. So the worst part was when you had to go to the restroom, and there was none, or you were thirsty, and there was a wonderful white only that looked really nice, and a dirty, filthy little thing, lower and awful, that we couldn't drink out of. Those were the kinds of things that said in subtle and yet not so subtle ways, we were a caste system. We were not equal.
Tell me a little bit more about your experience as an elementary school student.
Were
you precocious from the get-go?
Yeah, I was very fortunate. I think because I had old parents. My dad was 40 when I was born. There are a lot of advantages. They knew, they wanted me. They put all of their attention on me. I was reading at a very young age and actually going to school at a very young age. And I ended up finishing the first grade, just about to finish the first grade when I was 4. And the Negro superintendent was in the school. And I noticed that every time they had this big VIP, I would be taken out of the class and taken to the girls' restroom to hide. And the reason was that this VIP, Dr. Hayes, was my godfather. All the way back to when he hired my mother. And I should tell you, mother hid the pregnancy a long time, because if a woman was pregnant, didn't matter that she was married, she could not continue to teach. Mother was thin at that time, and she hid the pregnancy. She hid me with loose-fitting things up until almost April or May. I was born in August, and the big joke was, she always loved saying he was almost born in the classroom. He was born to teach. She did not want me to be a principal. She didn't want me in administration. She said he was born to teach. That's what, to her, that was the most noble thing you could do. And one day when I was hiding in that bathroom, really frustrated, embarrassed to be in the girls, I ran out. I got away from the big girl who was holding me in there, and ran right into Dr. Hayes. And he said, why are you in school, Freeman? And I said, I'm in the first grade. I'm about to grade. And that was not good. They took me out and made me go back to a little kindergarten, but I already knew the word. They brought me back the next year and hit me again, because you're still in first grade 5. So I spent when I was 5, teaching other kids. I always got a couple of slow kids and working with them on words and things to keep me busy. It was great. So it was great enrichment. It really was. I was very fortunate. And I always say this, was I that smart? No, I just had great parents who were educated, attentive, knew how to teach. They emphasized reading and math, ideas, talking. They allowed me to discuss issues. Any child who gets that background can move fast. Yeah.
Shifting. Did you have a sense as a child about legal authority in the city? Did you have a sense of the white government? Did you have a sense of, maybe it would have been measured, if at all, as a child, in some measure of wariness or apprehension? Did you have a sense of the capacity of police to do violence? Were those things apparent?
Well, we had studied government in maybe the 7th grade. We knew Boutwell was the name, and we knew Bull Connor, the police. We understood something about relationships between city government and managers and police. We also knew that police were not fair either. We had been stopped at different points, and they were not nice. My father looked international, much more so. I always say he married a beautiful chocolate woman, and here I am. But Daddy could pass for other things. He was more olive color, but rather straight and curly hair. And he talked very fast. And so when the police would stop him, and he always drove much too fast, he talked much too fast. And they would stop him, and they would say, Mr. Hrabowski, you got to slow down next time. We're going to have to give you a ticket. And then they'd look over and see me looking like him, but obviously knowing what I was from the kinky hair and everything else. Then they'd look back at him and then at his license and see the C. And all of a sudden they would go from Mr. Hrabowski to Freeman, you're a colored boy, as they began to write the ticket. You know, so the big joke, he always said, I was the best liability he ever had.
Did you and the family take note conversationally and otherwise about the explosion of sit-ins in February of 1960? Was that something that really...
Very frightening, because people knew each other, families knew each other. Reverend Shuttlesworth, Attorney Shores, these families knew each other, and we really did care about each other. And if it could happen to the most privileged people, it could happen to anyone. And there on Baum Hill in Birmingham, that's Smithfield, the other middle-class neighborhood, where people some of whom went to our church, sisters and brothers of people lived on both sides, and our mother was close to all of these people, and there were, literally, even in the church, there was a North Side group and a South Side group, and they were, again, the two middle-class groups. And so it's hard to explain just how close the groups were. So when there's a bomb, you immediately think it's right next door, because these are people you know. It's very frightening, very frightening. And we knew from decades about lynchings, about violence. We all knew, and it was very frightening. Yeah, very much so.
Tell me, if you would, do you recall May of '61 and the arrival of the Freedom Rider buses into Birmingham and all of that violence and chaos?
And all of that would have been discussed in church in different ways, and both in allusions in the sermon, but in youth fellowship. And one of the great things about my church was that we discussed ideas and books. And I mentioned Connie before. Her father, who was a Presbyterian minister, still worked, though, with 6th Avenue, and so he would help us with the youth fellowship at 6th Avenue even. And he was my high school counselor. And we discussed all those matters. That's the one thing that was really, we were developing critical thinking skills as we thought about the good and the bad and the ugly. What if things were different? What are the consequences of these actions? And all of that was, in many ways, elevating. These things were not discussed as if it was just for today. It was about what should a human being expect out of life? What does American democracy mean? All right? I'll never forget when I had a talk with my principal in high school after the demonstration, and he was being forced to put the kids out of school. And I'll never forget his having some of us read Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. It was just, it was amazing the way people got around all the bureaucracy when he was being told that he should be looking down on us, when he was saying to us, got to put you out of school. He did something that was very special. Instead of making it something that was embarrassing, he called the entire school together as one community. And he conducted that session in exactly the way he had conducted the Honor Society induction. And it brings tears, because he was absolutely brilliant. He was determined that those of us being suspended would know it was a badge of courage.
So tell me the story of the spring of '63. You're just 12 and a half years old.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this just torrent of protest would unfold in a couple of months. April and May. And
Sure.
How how did that history find you there in the city in those months?
I think I told you we were always in church. And I make students laugh sometimes because I say, I am not going to paint that as a picture where we were so happy to be there all the time. And I did not want to go listen to these different people from outside talk. I mean, and I'm sitting in the back of the room, and the way my parents could placate me was to let me just read my book or do my math. I loved math. And so I'd sit in the back of the church because you had to be there, and I'd listen to a bit. And you learned to sing the songs, and the songs were good. But amazingly, when I heard this man say that what he was proposing, and that is involving children in the march, could lead to children being able to go to the best schools in our city. Now that got my attention because I wanted to see just how smart these white kids were. I didn't think anybody was smarter than I was. And to me, though, smart was not about what you're born with. Smart had to do with how hard you were willing to work. My parents had to sometimes punish me for not going to sleep. I mean, I just wanted to keep working, and they were worried that I was working too hard. So, and to me, that was smart. When you work really hard and you achieve a lot, and you make A's not because you want the grades, but because you dare to know. All right. And but when he said that, I said, "Now that's worth listening to."
Do you remember who that was?
And I said, "What's the guy's name? What's this man's name?" He said, "King." It was my first time. I'll never forget. I said, "King? What a name, King." No, Reverend King, Reverend Martin Luther King. It was it was amazing. And then I began to listen to him and others, and I realized how well-spoken they were. Now, as it turns out, my pastor was also very polished as a speaker. He read a lot. We read books together. So we were accustomed to polished speakers, but this man was talking about the next level, what it would take to change things. Because what we don't remember is that while we knew things were not fair, we tended to think this is the way of the world. I suppose it's the way my descendants felt in slavery. It just is this way. It's awful, but this is the way of the world. And before that King message, that message from Dr. King, the thought was, since this is the way of the world, you've got to be really good to get a chance at all. He was changing the model, the vision, and saying it doesn't have to be this way, that we could be empowered to change it. Very different message. And did I believe him? I wanted to. Was I convinced it was going to happen? Absolutely not. If you've seen the world one way all of your life, even if it's just 12 years, it is the way it is. The best you can do is have hope and try. And that's what happened. And so, I mentioned that we have this exhibition right now at the Smithsonian for all the world to see, done by one of my colleagues, Maurice Berger, here at UMBC. And a part of the message of that exhibition is that the visual culture of the time had a greater impact than people realized. For the first time, people could see through TV exactly what was happening. For the first time, America saw the fire hoses, the dogs, the children being absolutely abused. And I'll never forget that first day that I saw that. After hearing Dr. King, I said, "Mama, Dad, I've got to go." And they said, "Absolutely not." No way. And I did something you just did not do. I said, "Then you guys are hypocrites." Well, you see, that may not sound like a big deal today, but at that time, you did not say disrespectful things to your parents. My dad could not believe I had said that. He said, "Go to your room and stay there." And it was the next morning that they had been up all night. But after being up all night, they came in and said I could go. Now, I tell my students all the time, by this point, while I thought my parents were unfair, because my point was, you make me go to all these meetings, I hear all this stuff, you tell me to think for myself, I'm thinking for myself, I want to do the right thing, I want to do what Dr. King, somebody you say you admire, wants me to do, and yet you're saying no. And they came in to explain. It wasn't that they didn't trust me. They did not trust me to be in that jail with those white people who didn't care about our children, about black children. And they said, "You're our treasure. We don't trust you to them." And I understand that now. I often ask myself, would I have allowed my child to go? I'm not sure I would have. But somehow they came in, they had been praying, and literally their eyes were red, and we prayed together and we cried. Now, I was crying because I was worried about them, worried about me. But quite frankly, all of a sudden I'd gotten really frightened. I was saying, "Oh my God." And my cousin, who was in the other bed, was laughing because he said, "No way am I letting those dogs bite me. I am not going." He was 2 years old, and he said, "Freeman can be stupid if he wants to." So it wasn't that I was that courageous. I did believe in the cause. I had said I was going to go, and I couldn't back out. Let's just be honest about it. I wanted to go, but I was frightened. And this is what happens to people so often, right? And because I was in a higher grade, and kids below 14 went to the juvenile place, they chose me. And because I was asking a lot of questions in a little training session, they chose me to lead a group of kids. And I learned what that meant. You're singing the songs, you're leading people in singing the songs, and you're keeping the kids from focusing on the police officers, because the police officers were trained to try to upset us. And if you ask any black kid, probably the white kid too, who is the one person that you really don't want anybody talking about? Your mother. And what were they doing? Oh yeah, they were just trying to upset us, because if they could show that we were throwing rocks or doing something violent, then they'd be justified in using the club or whatever. But if we were just walking along, it's very hard to justify the violence.
Pause for just 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
We're back on after the commercial break. President Hrabowski, let me ask you to even shift to a level of deeper detail.
Sure.
That story of, I'm so interested in that story about that night at home with
Yeah.
and that very difficult deliberation they faced, and quite understandable. You mentioned that you would be drawn in as a leader of a student training group in nonviolent training. Can you stay at kind of that level of detail and walk me through how you entered in, what you'd already seen in the streets, what was happening, where you had these meetings?
Yes, the training meetings were at 6th Avenue Baptist, my church, which was the sister church, and we'd be bussed over to the other place. And different people were telling us things to expect. That some of the younger kids would get upset and become homesick. We had to work to keep them quiet and calm. We practiced the songs. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. And it's amazing how singing those songs elevates you and gives you a high purpose. And I can still hear all these children singing these songs. And keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching on to freedom land. And amazingly, it gave you the strength to keep going, just to keep going. You didn't listen to the police. You weren't looking at cameras. You just focused. And I was to get there, and if allowed, I was to kneel with the kids and pray. Pray for the right to be a first-class American citizen. That's all. That's all we were asked. And I cannot tell you how much my knees were shaking. But the songs really helped. And we did a lot of praying, and it was very strong. I mean, it was saying, just say, "God, help me, keep moving." And we did. And we made it up to the steps. And that's when this guy with this really red face, looking so angry, looked down at me and said, "What do you want, little nigger?" Oh, God. I was so scared. And I looked up at him and I said, "Sir," not sir, but sir, "we want to kneel and pray." And he was so angry, he spat on me. I'll never forget it. He spat in my face, picked me up, and threw me in. They came and got the kids, and they just threw us into the paddy wagon.
You were on the steps of
City Hall, right from 16th Street, right there. And it was just awful. It was awful. I was in a daze. Just in a daze.
Where did they take you? The
Took to the nope. There's another juvenile place with bars and a big wire fence, and it put us in with the bad boys, and it was awful. For a week, I stayed 5 days. It was
12-year-old.
awful, but I was helping 8 and 9-year-olds. And a lot of the kids were not from middle-class homes. Keep that thought, that what we were doing was not universally accepted as the right thing to do. There were many of my teachers and others and neighbors who felt kids should be in school. Now, who could argue with that? So this was an experiment. And when people say, were you bothered that others were not agreeing? No, my parents understood. In fact, teachers had been told subtly through the Board of Education that the children of teachers, if children of teachers went to jail, those teachers would lose their jobs. My mother had lost a job before, as she always believed God will provide. But so they would, and they'd been told people with mortgages that banks might, it was, you called it on. It was amazing, and we might lose homes. You just didn't know. So you could understand people who had something already invested not wanting to give that up for an experiment. And so there were a few of us from the middle class neighborhood who went, but not many. Most of the kids were from the projects. Understandably, what is it that families have to lose? Understandable. But I think the advantage of that middle class situation was we had just a bit more exposure and could be supportive of other kids.
In those 5 days, did you see your parents?
No, could not. They would not allow parents. No. There were, I remember that somehow there were Bibles there, though. And I was not the kind of kid who could protect kids physically. I really was a fat math nerd. Not chubby little kid loving blueberry pie and math. All right? That was my life. I mean, heaven for me was eating some pie and doing math problems. And bad boys, and they were being encouraged to harass and beat up kids. And the way I kept my little kids, they would always be with me, trying to keep them from crying. But there were times when the bad boys would come in our direction, and I'd start reading aloud from the Bible. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And it always scared the hell out of them. And they would move back. It was powerful. It was great. And I would just say, thank you so much, Lord. Because I didn't know how to fight. That was not my life. It just wasn't. Right? And fortunately, there was a bad boy in there who had been in my mother's class. And he was also very supportive of me when he realized what my name was. I'll never forget that. It really did help. Yeah. And that was that experience. What the experience taught me was that even children can make decisions that can have an impact on the rest of their lives, and that children know the difference between right and wrong. And that children can suffer and be better for the suffering. It was an awful experience. It was so depressing. We were in the dark. They let us out for an hour or two a day, but it was gloomy. These guards were always trying to make us feel worse. And you'd hear them in there, and you'd hear kids hollering. You never knew what was going on. It was awful when I think back on it. But one of those days when maybe after 3 days or so, and families wanted to get their kids out, and Dr. King was saying, wait, he came with the parents, and they were all outside, and we were looking through the bars, and they were singing the songs, and he spoke, and he said, what you do this day will have an impact on children yet unborn. I'll never forget that. I didn't even understand it, but I knew it was powerful, very powerful. And there are nerves that are still raw just from looking at the faces of the children, trying to understand what does that mean. Powerful, very powerful.
What happens when you come out on the 5th day?
Oh, God, to see your parents. Wow, being the bright sun. You realize how much we take freedom for granted. We all do. Just being able to go outside and walk around. You really get to see what prisoners go through. Oh, my goodness. Oh, just the freedom to do whatever you want to do. to go to the store. It was amazing. It really was. And I wanted to get back to school. I was an A student. I wanted to be in school. And I'll never forget that as soon as we got back to school, well, I'll never forget, we got back to school, and within a day we were back there, and that's when the notice came. We had to be suspended. Oh, and suspension was like an embarrassment. And that's why I say what the principal did made such a difference.
And you were at what school?
Ullman High School.
Yeah. And the principal was?
The principal was George C. Bell, the person who is most responsible for my becoming a mathematician. He was a mathematician. He was a brilliant guy of small stature and a big booming voice. And when Mr. Bell spoke, everybody listened. And when a kid was not doing the right thing and he would boom down the hall, that kid, I don't care how big, would straighten up immediately. But he was absolutely brilliant. Now, it just so happens that George Bell is the uncle of Alma Vivian Powell. And my high school counselor, Reverend Rice, was, of course, the father of Condi Rice. And so it was an amazing school with very smart teachers and a lot of kids who were very high achievers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What was your, as those next few weeks through the end of May,
Mm-hmm.
middle of May,
Mm-hmm.
unfolded?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it gets pretty hot in the middle of the month. Finally, federal troops come into the city after a very hot period of a day and a half.
Yes, and I should tell you, academically, Mr. Bell had worked quietly with teachers to find ways to make sure kids could get homework at home. It was very nice. But what I will tell you is it was a very difficult period. And what I remember is finally having the federal courts to say, put those children back in school. And you can check this, but I'm almost sure the guy's name, was I right? The guy's name, I believe, was Judge Black. And we were in church when the news came. And, just amazing.
Did it feel like a victory?
Oh, God. Oh, everybody cried. Cried, really did. It was just to know that somebody white in power knew that we were not wrong and cared about children. Just knowing that there was decency among whites made a big difference. Really did. Really
Did
did.
you see anything else in the period? That was the single time you were arrested?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Did you witness other things that remain as just those flash images that just come to you when you think back on this stuff?
Oh, my God. It was that fall in September when, oh, God, the flashes of the hand and the ring. I mean, when one of my friends, when we were in church in September and things had begun to have signs of hope, of opening up in Birmingham. Remember all of the richness of my community, richness in terms of love and spirituality and hard work and mutual support. But you go downtown, I would go downtown, and I never saw one black in a position of power in downtown Birmingham, not even behind a cash register, let alone a policeman or a fireman. Nobody, everybody in any level of power was white. And to have the city fathers deciding to compromise with Dr. King and the group was a major victory. And we said things are changing. And we're in church that Sunday in September. And all of a sudden, the pastor gets a note
At the pulpit.
at the pulpit. He stops preaching and tells us that other church, our sister church, where relatives and of sons and daughters and fathers and mothers have been bombed, and didn't know how bad it was. It was just shock. And he said, please don't rush out. But it was the first time we'd ever seen church stopped in the middle. It had to be bad. People started driving in that direction. mother and father took us home because we didn't know whether that meant the next church was going to be bombed or whatever. And as it turns out, I thought back to different friends, one of whom was Cynthia. And I'd seen her on Friday, and I've said this before. I remember her so well. She was always very kind to me because I was younger than other classmates. She was always very nice to me. So if I was 12, she was 14. And she said, "Bye, Freeman." Oh, God. We said bye. And it seems to me it was she who said, "See you Monday. See you Monday." Yeah. And I knew she went to that church. I mentioned, so all these names, and she was one of them, but I saw her face there at the school. And when one of the girls had been given a ring that morning by her father, and they were not able to find her, and then found that hand. And everybody knew that hand with that ring. We had nightmares for years. It was like war. It was just awful. My parents said to me when I asked if I could go to the funeral that I could. And I'll never forget, I was to leave school. My parents had given me a notice, and my principal saw me, and this is education at its best. He came up to me and he said, "You're representing us today." And he looked at my tie, and it was not dark enough at that time. You really were supposed to wear dark ties to funerals. And he took his tie off and took my tie off. He tied his tie on me. It was amazing, the small things people can do to make a child feel special. And I'll never forget the 3 coffins with the nieces, the youngest of the 3. I think she was 11, McNair, in the middle, smaller. I'd never seen a coffin that small. It was awful. It was just awful. And Dr. King said, he said, life, what you need to know is that people who were the naysayers were saying that church was bombed, those girls were in those coffins because we went to jail. We upset things. And that's what happens. And they tried to tell us how mean-spirited, how awful people can be. These were blacks saying that. And here's Dr. King back, taking responsibility. And he looked into the faces of those parents and said, life is as hard as steel. As hard as steel. In other words, I don't know what to say. It's just so hard for all of us. I just remember that. I do. I really do. And I'll tell you what gave me hope in the midst of the darkness. It was the first time I'd seen whites in my church. There were rabbis and priests and Baptist ministers from it was amazing. And they cried.
Can you?
Yeah, give me a minute. Ooh.
I need a second.
Yeah. Yeah, give me a minute just to.
Okay.
Okay, we're back on after a short break. Let me ask.
Yes.
And we've. It's just so difficult.
Yeah.
The distance is like a day sometimes. I imagine, not like these many years, but like
Oh
a day.
yeah.
Maybe this is a good time to ask you a question of difficult reflection, and it's this: can you? And there is no fixed answer, I'm sure, to this question, but can you reflect a little bit on the issue of how those kinds of experiences do take their long toll on a person,
Sure.
and how you might gauge their implications in your life?
All right, I'm reading a book right now by David Brooks, The Social Animal, and one of the points of the book he talks about how we develop love and relationships and achievement. Is one of the points of the book is that we are all the products of our childhood experiences, and when we least expect it, things that happen to us as children have an impact on us. And so while we may think that what we do is the result of rational decision making, often circumstances and previous experiences come together to push us in one direction or another without even realizing it. What my parents worked to do after those difficult situations, what many parents worked to do, was to help us get beyond the bitterness, the anger, and even the hatred, right? And what they said over and over again is hatred eats on the inside. Hate the action or the act. Don't hate the person. I have to tell you, when Bull Connor died, my mother called me and she was crying. And I said, Mother, why are you crying about this man? This man was awful to us. And she said something that was so powerful. She said, Freeman, but he was somebody's child. All of what he did came because of how he was raised. And for me, that was an amazing moment of enlightenment. He was simply the product of his environment. And it was cathartic for me to just let it go. Let it go. And I have often thought about that moment. It was my mother's way of giving me her faith in life itself and in humanity. And it was also her way of saying, put your own experiences in perspective. And a part of being educated is being able to give context to whatever experiences you've had. And those of us who've been able to do that are much healthier as a result. I really do believe those words of King, that you judge people on the basis of content of character, not on race. You can find good and bad people in any race. And I'm here at the university with students from 150 countries, and I've really come to understand what's common among human beings from different cultures, different religions, right? And that character can transcend all of that. Integrity, those kinds of things. And so I think the reason I'm able to work so comfortably with my students from all kinds of backgrounds is that I really can see beyond the obvious differences and look for not only what's in somebody's heart, but that person's ability to think. And my whole life is focused on helping people to learn to do just that, to think well, and how to act with people, and to get beyond what we sometimes believe are the most important things. All right, how we look, to move to how we think and act.
I mean, not to summarize too acutely, but it's probably a fair thing, and I mean this as a sincere compliment, that your professional work has had the form of creating new ways for children to come up in the world.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
The
And
Meyerhoff Scholars Program.
Sure.
These are not small efforts.
I appreciate that. I like the fact that this is a campus that really does talk about these issues of race and ethnicity, and works to create a climate in which people can say what they really think. If you don't allow people to say what they really think, then they're simply saying what's convenient, and it doesn't get to the point of values. And I think this is what we need in American society. We need opportunities for people, whether they are 50 or 15, to say what they really think. We tend to believe what we've seen on TV. If what you see on TV is violence, and you've seen certain groups looking like they're always doing things that are stealing and things that are bad, that's what you believe. My students who are around all kinds of people are far more tolerant. My students who come from areas where everybody looks exactly the same, regardless of what race, will tend to be far more comfortable stereotyping and assuming all people are the same. And I think that's one of the things about education. is to teach people, not just about people in this country, but around the world, that we are the products of our childhood experiences. Every one of us has some good in us. We can pull that out. And those are the kinds of things I learned through that experience.
You moved from Birmingham in 1966?
You are good,
Was it
yes.
fall of 66
That's
you went away to
exactly
school?
right.
Yeah.
Now, I should tell you, I spent summers in different places.
Yeah, and I want to ask about that as well.
Yeah,
How
before
old were you when you
66.
first moved for one of those summer experiences?
I was in Massachusetts, and I was 13, and I was going to the 11th grade, and this was going to be my first experience in an all-white class in math and literature, chemistry. And it was clear the education was so rich. It was powerful. It was rigorous. It was challenging. It was hard. I loved it. And when other kids would not raise their hands, I would raise my hand to just try the answer. And it didn't take me long to realize not one teacher would ever call on me. They would look right through me. They were never mean. I wasn't there. It was amazing. So I always call it Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. But it was an awful feeling to feel totally unimportant. In contrast to my old black school, where people were delighted that I wanted to try an answer. When they would tease me and they'd push me and they would say, go for it, right? None of that taught me the importance of teachers. Teachers can either elevate us or even through a look, push us down. And we see both in all kinds of situations among all races, depending on where you are. And what I can say is I learned a lot. When I came back to chemistry, I was well prepared. I had finished the course that summer. All right, same thing in math, and it was just, so I was really well prepared. But that experience also taught my parents that they were not willing to trust me to go to some of the predominantly white schools in the East who were interested in my attending. They just didn't know. And so I left in 1966, and I went to Hampton. Because Booker Washington was a graduate of Hampton, and we respected Mr. Washington when he came to found Tuskegee for generations. And it was an amazing experience because half my teachers were white at Hampton, particularly in the math and science area, and they were wonderful. It was the first time I'd been around whites, and they were so caring and decent, and they were there to help those black kids succeed. And it was then that I came to understand, really, there are a lot of nice white people. And I was close to mathematicians and philosophers, and it was great. It was great.
Did you come home those summers to Birmingham?
I came home in the summers, came home at Christmas time, and in the latter, and I actually decided after my freshman year to take a course at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Took the next calculus course just to see what it would be like, and to see what education then, because some of my friends had gone to UAB and to Tuscaloosa, and it was an all-white class, and to my amazement, what I had found at Hampton became even more understandable. At Hampton, I learned that while I was best in my school, in the top group, and an A student, that I was not as well prepared as black children who had gone to either prep schools or to very integrated white schools in the North. Now, I told you, nobody's going to work harder than I do, all right? And the girl at the time that I liked was getting the top score. She was a geometry champion for the state. She had Latin, which I hadn't had. She's just much better prepared. And so I said openly one day when she got 100, I'm going to marry her one day. And I did, by the way, 4 years later. But I was not as well prepared. It was clear to me that our education had not been as rigorous. I'd had enough education, though, that I could work so hard I could still get all A's, but they were not the highest A's. That first year, I had to work on that. But I came back to UA, and I wanted to see how well prepared those kids were, the white kids. And this was in the Cal 2, Cal 3 course or something, Cal 3. And It turned out that the average in the classes was maybe in the 60s, and I always got 98 to 100. And the guy finally came up to me, the white professor, and he said, "Where are you from?" Well, because I was making A pluses. I was just better. What I came to understand was, it wasn't just that the education for black kids was not what it should have been. Those white kids from Alabama were not well prepared. Years later, as I look at standardized tests, I see exactly that. But I had no idea. I always thought their education was so much better. No, was not the case. And interestingly enough, when I think back, we had some really good teachers, some of whom had gotten grad degrees in northern states because they couldn't get them there. So we had a solid education, and I had better than most because of the other experiences from Massachusetts and NSF program at Tuskegee. My parents were constantly giving me these extra experiences, and we read everything. So that was really solid. We were reading all the time. When I say it was not as well prepared, I had through pre-calculus, but my top kids at Hampton had calculus in high school.
Tell me a little bit about your educational background.
I hadn't had calculus. So when they took it, and I was taking it for the first time, they had already had all of that, those kinds of experiences. But my point is, we all suffered because of segregation. When you've got to put everything separate, different administrations, you're spending money where it should have been on those kids. And we didn't realize, not just black children, but white children were not getting the best either.
Tell me about how you watched Birmingham evolve. I guess beginning in '66, it'll be this kind of pattern.
Yes.
Because you're in college and then graduate school 5 years after that. So I guess it's probably a pattern of periodic visits, summer and
regular
visits over the years.
Sure.
Your parents' lives are
Sure.
moving on. And
Sure.
I'm just interested in how you watched the city change from that kind of lens, that in and out
interesting.
lens.
I saw more and more of my friends going to predominantly white schools in Alabama, to UAB, Tuscaloosa, Auburn, and becoming connected to those places while others continued to go to the HBCUs. But I think I was most proud. I was really proud of Birmingham when Richard Arrington became the mayor, because how many cities had a PhD in science as a mayor? That said so much about progress we had made. It really did. And I continued to know my city primarily through my church, 6th Avenue. And more people were moving to UAB, doctors, people in med school, and they'd come often to 6th Avenue. And I saw this influx of people moving to Birmingham because of the university, biggest employer, and well-educated people. And I saw those changes. At the same time, I was assuming that the violence I saw in northern cities was not occurring in places like Birmingham, because it wasn't that level of violence among blacks on blacks, until I got back there and saw the same thing I saw in cities in this area, I saw there in Birmingham. So on the one hand, you have the progress, more educated people going to the universities. On the other hand, you've got the underclass killing each other. Same challenges you face wherever you go in the country. And it was that dichotomy that was, and continues to be, a major problem.
And of course, Birmingham's demographic shift, because the city boundaries aren't that big. And all this has happened in the 60s.
Yes. And people have moved, that's exactly right, into the suburban areas. And more the Birmingham City schools have become black. And before, Phillips and other places that were white, and you had a few black kids. And some people have said, why didn't I go to integrated schools that I could have? Well, I think I was in the 10th grade when we finally had integration. Again, my mother simply didn't trust me to be in a school with teachers who didn't want me there. And I remember so well when my friends who went to my church integrated Ramsey High School and Phillips. There were all kinds of problems, but in those moments of just desegregation, just as was the case with the University of Alabama, very decent whites were their parents, and they became violent. They threw things at these children. You saw the worst of humanity. And understandably, my parents did not want me being a part of that. No. Even if the education was supposed to be better, what my parents, who had been teachers, knew was if teachers don't want you there, you don't get the best education. You just don't. Now, there were some decent people there, of course, but how would you know who's willing to get beyond prejudice and just help a child? That was the issue. Mm-hmm.
Tell me about your effort to create the Meyerhoff Scholars Program and what that does.
Sure.
What that vision is.
Sure. When I went to the University of Illinois after graduating from Hampton, I noticed that, of course, there were no black faculty, and there were only several of us in mathematics, and others were not doing well. And people didn't expect me to do well. I remember, I tell my students this story all the time. I earned an A- on a test in topology, and the professor wrote on my paper, "You did surprisingly well." Now, remember I said my mother was in English, and so I went up to him after class and I said, "Why the adverb?" And he didn't know what I was talking about at first. And I pointed to the word, and he simply turned red. And he said, "Well, it's because you're from a small school." No. And it was at that point, I remember that second grade experience. I could decide I'm a victim. The man doesn't expect me to do well. Let me get out of here. And I remember that same statement, "No time to be a victim. Don't let this man define you." And by the end of the semester, he was feeling so guilty, not just about the word, but about not telling me the truth. The fact was he had never seen a black in a graduate course in mathematics. And everything he knew about blacks would suggest they would not do well. And I got an A in his class, but more important than that, he got to know me as a person, and I got to know him. It wasn't that he was a bad person. We expect from people what we're accustomed to seeing. And that was all it was. But all of that showed me that we had a problem. You don't have many blacks in math and science. When I went around the country trying to find one predominantly white university that was educating at least 10 people a year, and all of science and engineering that would go on, who would go on to grad school, couldn't find one. And fortunately, I had met Bob Meyerhoff, who is not black, he's Jewish and a philanthropist, and we had conversations about black males, and he wanted to make a difference in that group. And we married the two ideas of black males, underrepresentation in science, and started this program with an eye towards seeing what can we do? Can we create a program that has those elements necessary to ensure that students of color would not only succeed but excel in science and engineering? And we were defining excelling as doing so well they could go on and get PhDs from the best universities in the country, and MD PhDs. And it has been an amazing journey since 1989. And now we have hundreds and hundreds who've actually earned PhDs and MD PhDs. We actually now have students with those degrees on the medical faculties of Harvard and Stanford, Duke, even UAB, Hopkins, Michigan, all over the country. And so the numbers are growing all the time. So it's a dream fulfilled. It really is. And for many scientists, it's the first time they've seen large numbers of students of color excelling in science, not just the exceptional one. That's the idea. We've had an exceptional one since Tuskegee and George Washington Carver. Now it's time to have many more. And so working with the national academies on these issues, I have had a chance to chair the most recent committee and to look at what we're going to need to do to take the numbers to the next level. And all of that comes as a result of, when you think about it, when I think about it, of the hope I got from those experiences as a child. And the notion again, and I've never said it this way before, that just because it's this way doesn't mean it has to be this way. Now, when we were doing the Meyerhoff, it never occurred to me to say that, and yet all those experiences from before, if we could move from my not being able to sit in a classroom with whites to my being president of a predominantly white university from age 12 to age 40 in 30 years, Why couldn't we move from having no blacks with PhDs in science to having many? So it's amazing how one experience does inform another. It's very interesting even to me.
Let's pause just one quick sec.
That is really, yeah.
We're back.
Yes,
Finish up
yes,
today,
yes.
President Hrabowski, thank you
Yeah.
for all this generous
Sure,
time.
sure.
Let me invite you to reflect a little bit here as we close on how you kind of take the measure of the history you've lived through and thought so much about, and the work you're doing now, and how you knit those two things together to define your work and your vision as you look
Sure.
ahead. Yeah.
You know, in 1963, only about 2% of African Americans had completed college. Today, we're moving towards 20%, 17, 18%. But you didn't need a college education to get a good job. Today, you need more education. What was the civil rights movement really about? Well, in very basic terms, it was about people wanting to have the opportunities that all other Americans have. But it really is about more than opportunity for this reason. Today, people have the opportunity to go to college, and yet a lot don't. So what's missing here? It's about having families and communities that focus on education and on values and on dreams and the connection between hard work and reaching the dreams. This is where we are challenged today. Many families, black and white, don't necessarily know what they need to do to help their children to develop the skills they need, the values, so they can get the education. And without the education, they continue to be in the underclass. And so for privileged people of any race, all kinds of opportunities are available. So for those of us in that top group, 25, 30%, things are much better. They really are. And if we're not careful, we forget about those at the bottom. There is the challenge that we face, to not be duped into thinking these things don't matter anymore. I would say race still matters, but I would add on, I'm as concerned about poor white children as black children. That in either case, unless somebody teaches those children to read well, the future won't be bright. That's the issue we face. And history has taught us the focus on education and values can make all the difference in the world.
Thanks for being so generous to invite us here and spend this time with us. It's been a great privilege.
It has been a privilege for me. You are quite good. Both of you. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Thank you.
The videographer has such sensitivity, I felt him.
This video raises questions, and I need for you to be extremely honest in the comments when answering them. And just so you know, I have 2 questions. Number 1, tell me your thoughts about this video in the comments. And number 2, who would you like to see me do a video on next? Now please be honest in the comments when answering these questions. Share this video with anyone you deem necessary, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.